The year is 1961. The location is a remote radar station on the Kola Peninsula, a desolate finger of land pointing into the icy maw of the Barents Sea. Outside, the Arctic wind howls a song of absolute indifference, piling snow against the concrete angles of the bunker. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of ozone, hot vacuum tubes, and the bitter aroma of chicory coffee brewed for the third time. This is the edge of the world, the sacred frontier of the Soviet Union. For Senior Lieutenant Alexei Volkov of the Voiska PVO, the Soviet Air Defense Forces, this is the center of the universe. His world is a 15-inch cathode ray screen, a universe of swirling green phosphor. For 12 hours a day, he watches the sweep of the radar beam, a hypnotic green line that methodically paints a picture of the airspace he is sworn to protect. He knows its rhythms, its ghosts. He can distinguish the signature of a stray weather balloon from the flutter of a flock of geese migrating at an unnatural altitude. His eyes, and the network of eyes just like his, form an impenetrable shield, a testament to the technological and ideological might of the motherland. The sky belongs to the party. The sky belongs to the people. Tonight, the screen is quiet. The usual commercial traffic from Norway is following its prescribed corridor far to the west. The Arctic is a vast, empty canvas. Alexei allows himself a moment of weary pride. After the American U-2 spy plane was swatted from the sky the year before, a new confidence had surged through the PVO. They had proven that not even the highest-flying American Viper could penetrate their domain. The shield was real. It was absolute. He leans forward, rubbing the fatigue from his eyes. The green line continues its sweep, left to right, a slow, rhythmic pulse. But then, something. A flicker. Not a blip, not a solid return like a plane, but a transient burst of energy, a phantom anomaly on the very edge of the screen's range, high in the stratosphere. It is there for one sweep, and gone on the next. Alexei freezes, his training screams at him. Solar interference, atmospheric clutter, a faulty capacitor in the magnetron. But his gut, an instrument honed by thousands of hours of staring into this green abyss, tells him something different. The flicker had a quality to it, a fleeting artificial sharpness. It was like seeing the ghost of a reflection in a dark window. He adjusts the gain, straining the sensitive equipment. He speaks into the headset, his voice calm, professional, betraying none of the sudden iciness in his stomach. Sector 4 Gamma, possible transient phenomenon at maximum range, bearing 015. Stand by for confirmation. The reply from his watch commander is laced with boredom. Acknowledged, Senior Lieutenant. Probably the Aurora playing tricks again. Log it and continue sweep. The Aurora. Yes, that was the logical explanation. The northern lights were a constant, ethereal nuisance, painting the sky with radioactive curtains that could play havoc with their sensitive electronics. But this felt different. It wasn't the slow, painterly wash of the Aurora. It was a pinprick, a whisper. He spends the next hour with his face nearly pressed to the screen, his coffee forgotten, growing cold beside him. He sees nothing. The sky is empty. The shield is intact. He logs the event as instructed. Unidentified atmospheric energy event, likely solar in origin. But as he writes the words, a profound and unsettling question forms in the back of his mind. He is a guardian on a castle wall, staring out into a dark forest. He is certain the wall is too high to be climbed. But what if the enemy isn't trying to climb the wall? What if they have found a way to simply float, unseen, just beyond the tree line, watching and waiting? The thought is absurd, a dismissal of everything he has been trained to believe. He pushes it away, but the feeling of being watched lingers long after his shift has ended. This feeling of profound unease, experienced by countless unseen operators like Alexei Volkov, was a quiet, spreading crack in the foundation of Soviet military certainty. They were watching for a direct assault, for a singular, identifiable threat, but they were entirely unprepared for the reality of what America was actually doing. If you find these hidden histories of the Cold War compelling and want to understand the true psychological and technological impact of the era, consider subscribing to Cold War Impact for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. To understand the depth of the Soviets' eventual shock, one must first inhabit their reality in the late 1950s and early 60s. This was not a reality of doubt, it was one of monumental state-sponsored certainty. The Soviet Union saw itself as a besieged fortress, surrounded by the aggressive capitalist powers of NATO. But within that fortress, they were assured of their strength. Propaganda was not just a tool, it was the air they breathed. Newsreels shown before films in cinemas across the Union depicted row upon row of stoic soldiers, endless columns of tanks, and, most importantly, sleek interceptor jets screaming into the sky. Posters on factory walls showed heroic PVO rocketeers standing before the S-75 Davina missile system, the very weapon that had brought down Gary Power's U-2. The message was unambiguous. Soviet airspace was sacred and inviolable. General Pavel Batitsky, the commander of the Moscow Air Defense District, who personally gave the order to fire on Powers, became a national hero. The incident was a source of immense national pride, a public and dramatic validation of their entire defense doctrine. Their strategy was fundamentally reactive, a strategy of the shield. They built the most extensive and sophisticated integrated air defense system the world had ever seen. From the Baltic Sea to the Bering Strait, they layered thousands of radars, hundreds of surface-to-air missile batteries, and legions of interceptor aircraft into a dense, overlapping web. It was a static, Herculean effort designed to detect and destroy any enemy that dared to cross their borders. It was a brute force solution, technologically impressive, but philosophically rigid. Their entire mindset was focused on the border, on the moment of penetration. The idea that a threat could exist perpetually before that moment, without ever crossing the line, was a strategic blind spot of continental proportions. While the Soviets perfected their shield, the Americans were busy reforging the sword. The American mindset was one shaped not by defense of the homeland, but by global power projection and a deep, visceral fear of a nuclear Pearl Harbor. The launch of Sputnik in 1957 had sent a shockwave of paranoia through the Pentagon and the White House. The terrifying possibility of a Soviet first strike, a bolt from the blue, became the single most dominant fear driving American military policy. The man tasked with preventing this nightmare was General Curtis LeMay, the iron-willed, cigar-chomping commander of the Strategic Air Command, or SAC. LeMay was not a man who believed in shields. He believed in overwhelming, relentless, and immediate retaliatory power. His philosophy was simple. The only way to prevent a war was to be so terrifyingly prepared to fight one that the enemy would never dare to make the first move. For LeMay, having a fleet of bombers sitting on the ground, even on high alert, was an unacceptable vulnerability. A surprise missile attack could wipe them out in minutes. The answer, he concluded, was radical, audacious, and logistically staggering. The answer was to take his bombers and keep them in the air, permanently. This was the genesis of Operation Chrome Dome. It wasn't just a plan, it was a fundamental shift in the nature of nuclear deterrence. The core idea was to maintain a fleet of B-52 Stratofortress bombers on continuous airborne alert, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. These were not mere patrol flights. Each of these aircraft was a flying thermonuclear arsenal carrying multiple hydrogen bombs, each one many times more powerful than the weapon that had vaporized Hiroshima. The machine at the heart of this operation was the B-52 itself. To see one on the ground was to be humbled by its scale. A behemoth of aluminum and wire, with a wingspan stretching over 185 feet, propelled by 8 roaring jet engines that stained the sky black on takeoff. But its true purpose was realized in the air, where it could loiter for punishingly long hours, a flying testament to American industrial might. The operation was a marvel of airborne choreography. 12 or more B-52 seconds were in the air at any given moment, flying one of 2 primary routes. One took them from bases in the American Midwest, up across Canada and the North Atlantic toward the Mediterranean. The other, the one that would have appeared as a ghost on Lieutenant Volkov's screen, was a brutal, soul-crushing path over Alaska, north into the Arctic Ocean, hugging the outer edges of Soviet early warning radar coverage over the pole. They would fly for up to 24 hours, refueling mid-air from KC-135 Stratotanker jets in a delicate and dangerous aerial ballet. Each bomber would fly to a designated, fail-safe point in the sky, a point of no return. There, they would orbit, awaiting one of 2 messages from SAC headquarters. One was the recall order, telling them to return to base. The other was the go code, the authenticated command to proceed to their pre-assigned targets inside the Soviet Union and unleash nuclear hell. This was the American approach, It was not a static shield, but a dynamic, ever-present threat. It was a ghostly patrol, a celestial ballet of destruction held in perfect, terrifying suspension. While the Soviet PVO stared intently at their borders, waiting for an enemy to cross a line, the Americans had created a new reality. They had placed a ring of airborne nuclear platforms around the Soviet Union, a fleet of invisible executioners flying in endless circles, just over the horizon, just beyond the reach of the green radar sweep. The Soviets were guarding their front door, unaware that an army was already living permanently on their lawn. The Soviet Union's expectations were, in essence, a reflection of their own strategic philosophy. That any attack would be a dramatic, explicit penetration of their sovereign airspace. Their sophisticated radar networks, stretching across thousands of kilometers, were designed to give ample warning of a massed bomber attack or the telltale signature of a lone, high-altitude spy plane. They anticipated the unmistakable blips of enemy aircraft breaching their territory, triggering a rapid, pre-planned response of interceptors and surface-to-air missiles. This was a war of clear lines, of defined borders, of targets that announced their hostile intent by their very presence inside Soviet airspace. Their training scenarios, their defensive doctrines, and even their national psyche were geared toward this direct confrontation. The idea of a constant, lurking threat just outside their detectable range, never technically crossing the line but always present, was not just unanticipated, it was conceptually alien. They expected to see a fist raised, poised to strike. What they failed to grasp was that the American fist was already there, perpetually clenched, hovering inches from their face, an eternal, silent menace. This profound disconnect between expectation and reality would lead to moments of truly jarring revelation for the men on the ground. The collision, when it first registered, wasn't a single explosive event, but a series of unsettling whispers, anomalies, and unconfirmable suspicions. It was a creeping realization that their meticulously constructed shield had a vast, invisible membrane just beyond its perceived edge. Consider the frigid, desolate expanse of the Kara Sea in the summer of 1960. Lieutenant Commander Boris Kuznetsov, a grizzled veteran of the Soviet Navy's Northern Fleet, commanded a small patrol vessel. His mission: to monitor maritime traffic and, crucially, to track any airborne anomalies near Soviet Arctic territory. His ship was equipped with relatively crude but robust radar designed for surface contact and low-flying aircraft. One afternoon, under a vast, slate-grey sky that pressed down on the churning waters, Kuznetsov was reviewing routine radar logs. His operator, a young conscript named Sergei, called out, "Commander, a faint return, extreme high altitude, bearing 330, very short duration." Kuznetsov, accustomed to false alarms and instrument quirks in the harsh Arctic environment, grunted. "Atmospheric, Sergei, log it. Probably a meteor." But Sergei persisted. "Commander, the signature. It's almost too consistent for a meteor." And it appeared on 2 successive sweeps, very precisely. Kuznetsov, intrigued, moved to the console. The green line swept. Nothing. Then, on the very edge of the screen, a tiny, almost ethereal blip, high above the traditional flight paths, incredibly fast, and then gone. It wasn't a weather balloon. It wasn't the faint ghost of a polar aurora. It had the angular precision of something man-made, yet it was at an altitude and speed that defied their conventional understanding of enemy bombers. "What do you make of that, Sergei?" Kuznetsov asked, his voice low. Sergei shrugged, his brow furrowed. "It's too high for their fighters, too fast for their old bombers, and our interceptors cannot reach that altitude without a long climb. If it is an aircraft, it is not one we know." This was not the roar of enemy engines, not the visual confirmation of an encroaching wingtip. It was a statistical anomaly, a technological whisper on the wind. But the implication was chilling. If it was an aircraft, it was operating in a realm that their interceptors could barely touch, and at the very limit of their detection. This wasn't an invasion. It was an elusive, mocking dance on the precipice of their defense. The most potent and persistent shock came, however, to the ground-based radar operators. Imagine Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov, not to be confused with Alexei of the Kola Peninsula, stationed near Novaya Zemlya, an unforgiving archipelago in the Arctic Ocean. For months in 1959 and 1960, Dmitri's team had been plagued by what they initially logged as persistent high-altitude clutter. The pattern was maddeningly consistent. Every few hours, or sometimes just once a day, a faint, fleeting signal would appear on the very fringes of their long-range detection, always at altitudes exceeding 50,000 feet, often closer to 60 or even 70,000 feet. The blip would be fleeting, often disappearing before they could get a precise lock or vector, a fighter to investigate. When they did scramble an interceptor, typically a MiG-17 or MiG-19, the American aircraft, if it was indeed an aircraft, would simply fade away, either turning slightly or descending to blend into ground clutter, only to reappear hours later, almost in the same spot, continuing its slow, inexorable orbit. The PVO interceptors, though fast and powerful, simply couldn't sustain high-altitude patrols indefinitely. They were designed for sprints, for quick, decisive interceptions. The American craft, whatever it was, seemed capable of an endurance that bordered on the supernatural. Dmitri reported these occurrences up the chain of command with increasing frustration. His superiors, steeped in the doctrine of tangible threats, often dismissed them as either equipment malfunctions or the vagaries of Arctic weather. The official line remained: Soviet airspace was secure. But Dmitri and his colleagues, the men staring at the glowing screens, knew different. They knew the patterns. They knew the persistence. One particularly clear day in late 1960, the weather was perfect. No aurora, no storms. Dmitri's radar operator, a young, intensely focused private named Igor, swore he had a lock. "Commander, bearing 005, altitude 70,000 feet. I have a sustained return for 3 sweeps." Dmitri rushed over. There it was. A small but undeniable blip, moving slowly, deliberately, just outside their effective range. He ordered a scramble. 2 MiG-19 seconds, already on quick reaction alert, roared to life and clawed their way into the sky. Their afterburners painted fiery streaks against the pale blue Arctic. The interceptors raced north, guided by Dmitri's frantic radio calls. "Report visual! Report visual!" After an agonizing 10 minutes, a breathless pilot, Captain Gennady Orlov, radioed back. "Negative visual, control. We are at maximum altitude, fuel critical. Nothing on our airborne radar. It's gone." But on Dmitri's screen, the blip was still there. Faint, tantalizingly out of reach, but there. It was as if the American aircraft was deliberately teasing them, floating just beyond the grasp of their fastest fighters, a ghost ship in the sky. The immediate aftermath of these encounters was a scramble for answers, a desperate attempt to reconcile observed reality with established doctrine. Reports from individual radar stations, like those of Alexei, Boris, and Dmitri, flowed into regional headquarters, then to Moscow. Each report was, on its own, an isolated incident, easily explained away. But collectively, they began to form a mosaic of unsettling regularity. The PVO command in Moscow was initially baffled. Their most advanced electronic intelligence equipment, designed to detect American reconnaissance flights, was picking up something, a unique electronic signature, strong and consistent, but always just beyond the border, never penetrating. It was the signature of a B-52 bomber, but B-52 seconds were heavy strategic bombers designed for long-range attacks, not high-altitude reconnaissance. And why were they always there? Why did they never cross? The certainty that had defined Soviet air defense doctrine began to crack. The U-2 shoot-down had proven their ability to destroy an enemy within their borders. But what about an enemy that never truly entered? An enemy that simply circled, patiently, eternally, just outside? The psychological impact began to set in. A nagging doubt, a creeping suspicion that they were not seeing the full picture, that the Americans had found a way to not just penetrate, but to dominate the airspace beyond the PVO's perceived reach, turning their formidable shield into a mere inner curtain. The immediate reaction was not panic, but a frustrated, deeply unsettling confusion, an inability to fit this new, persistent threat into their established worldview. The initial confusion within the Soviet air defense forces slowly curdled into a state of chronic, high-grade anxiety. What men like Alexei, Boris, and Dmitri had experienced as isolated, baffling incidents were now being understood in a terrifying new context. These were not random incursions or equipment glitches, they were points on a line, notes in a symphony. The Americans were not just probing their defenses, they had established a permanent, systematic presence on the very doorstep of the motherland. The pattern was becoming agonizingly clear. This was the relentless, grinding reality of Operation Chrome Dome. From the American perspective, it was a logistical masterpiece, a demonstration of industrial and military stamina that was simply unparalleled. It was a 24-hour-a-day, 365-day-a-year airborne siege. While a Soviet radar operator finished his grueling 12-hour shift and trudged home through the snow, the B-52 that had haunted his screen was being replaced by another, identical bomber, seamlessly taking its place in the sky. As one KC-135 tanker peeled away, its fuel tanks dry, another was already ascending from a base in Greenland or Alaska to meet the next thirsty bomber. It was a conveyor belt of Armageddon. The system was designed for zero downtime. Maintenance schedules were brutal. Crews were pushed to the limits of human endurance, living on stimulants and sheer professionalism, flying missions that lasted an entire day, knowing that a single coded message could send them on a one-way trip into nuclear fire. For the Soviets, who could only glimpse the faintest electronic echoes of this machine, the effect was profound. Their entire defense network, built for sharp, decisive moments of conflict, was now subjected to a constant, low-level pressure that never ever ceased. It was like trying to sleep with a single, maddening drop of water hitting a tin plate in an otherwise silent room, a sound that, over time, could drive a man insane. The unfolding reality of this relentless pressure is best understood not as a single narrative, but as a series of recurring nightmares played out in different theaters by different men, all experiencing the same feeling of technological and psychological helplessness. One such nightmare unfolded in the electronic warfare bunkers of the Baltic Military District in 1962. Here, Captain Valery Orlov, a brilliant but perpetually stressed signals intelligence officer, was tasked with a seemingly impossible job to analyze and find a way to counter the electronic emissions of these phantom American aircraft. His world was one of crackling, static, oscillating waveforms and the faint, alien chirps of enemy technology. For weeks, Valery's team had been tracking the B-52 seconds powerful AN divided by Alt-6B jammer pods. They knew, theoretically, what they were, but seeing them in action was another matter entirely. One evening, a chrome dome flight path drifted slightly closer to the coast of Estonia than usual. This was the chance Valery had been waiting for. He ordered his most powerful ground-based radar, codenamed Tall King, to paint the target, to lock onto it with a powerful, focused beam of energy. The moment the Tall King radar went active, Valery's monitoring consoles lit up like a New Year's celebration. The B-52, still dozens of kilometers away over the frigid Baltic Sea, responded instantly. It wasn't a passive target, it was an electronic hornet's nest. The bomber's electronic countermeasures suite erupted. Valery's operators watched in stunned disbelief as their radar screens dissolved into a blizzard of white noise. One moment, they had a faint but solid contact. The next, their screens showed 100 false targets, or a solid wall of impenetrable static. The American bomber had not just disappeared, it had erased the very sky in which it flew. "Report!" Valery barked, his knuckles white on the console's edge. "No report, Captain," an operator shouted back over the electronic din. "We have nothing, it's everywhere and nowhere." They tried frequency hopping, desperately switching their radar between different bandwidths to find a clear channel. But the American ECM suite was just as agile, a predatory electronic intelligence that anticipated their every move, smothering each new frequency with a fresh wave of digital garbage. For 15 agonizing minutes, the most powerful air search radar in the Baltic sector was rendered completely blind, a multi-million ruble monument to futility. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the jamming ceased. The screen returned to normal. The B-52, having made its point, had serenely continued on its orbital path, leaving behind a bunker full of bewildered and deeply unnerved Soviet officers. The message was clear. Not only could they fly where they wanted, just out of reach, but if the Soviets even tried to get a clear look, the Americans could pluck out their eyes at will. A different kind of tension played out in the skies near the Bering Strait, the narrow stretch of water separating Siberia from Alaska. Here, the game was one of physical interception. The Soviet pilots of the 865th Fighter Aviation Regiment were the tip of the spear, the men who would be called upon to make visual contact. In the winter of 1963, a young, cocky pilot, Lieutenant Mikhail Belov, was on alert in his MiG-21, an aircraft he considered an invincible silver dart. The call came just after dawn. A high-altitude target was tracking parallel to the coast, slightly closer than usual. A potential navigational error by the Americans. A rare opportunity. Mikhail's jet screamed off the icy runway, his G-suit pressing him into his seat as he rocketed toward the stratosphere. His mission was simple. Get close, get pictures, and prove to the high command that these ghosts were real. As he climbed past 40,000 feet, the air grew thin, and the sky turned a deep, dark violet. Ground control crackled in his ears, feeding him vectors. Target bearing 090, 100 kilometers. Altitude constant, 60,000 feet. Mikhail pushed his machine to its limits. His radar was a small, primitive scope, but it showed a faint blip precisely where controls said it would be. He was closing. For the first time, a Soviet pilot was about to lay eyes on a chrome dome bomber. The adrenaline was afire in his veins. 50 kilometers ground control updated. He should be in visual range. Mikhail strained his eyes, scanning the impossibly vast emptiness ahead. Nothing. Just the curve of the earth and the cold, distant Sunday. Negative visual, he transmitted, his voice tight with frustration. Check your systems, Lieutenant. Our readings are solid. He is directly ahead of you. But there was nothing there. Mikhail's fuel gauge was dropping at an alarming rate. The MiG-21 was a thoroughbred, built for a short, violent sprint, not a high-altitude marathon. As he reached the point of no return for his fuel, he finally saw it. Not the plane itself, but the faintest, thinnest line of white against the dark blue sky, a contrail. It was impossibly high, impossibly far away. The B-52 was real, but it was still a phantom, a ghost leaving a whisper of its passage in the frozen upper atmosphere. It hadn't made an error. It was exactly where it wanted to be. The Soviets had scrambled their best, and all they had managed to do was get close enough to see that they still weren't close at all. Mikhail turned his jet back toward home, the feeling of invincibility replaced by a cold, hollow sense of impotence. This growing dread was not confined to the air or the radar bunkers. It seeped downwards, into the very heart of the Soviet strategic forces. The recurring, meaningful symbol of this new American dominance became not a sight, but a sound, or rather, the electronic ghost of a sound. For the Soviet military, it was the hum. This wasn't an audible hum, but a persistent, low-level signal that their vast network of listening posts and intelligence ships began to catalogue. It was the constant, predictable electronic chatter of the SAC Airborne Command Network, the communications between the bombers, the tankers, and their bases in Nebraska. It was the navigation signals, the telemetry bursts, the endless drone of a system that never slept. This electronic hum became the background radiation of the Cold War. For a submarine commander surfacing his boat for a brief transmission in the Arctic, the hum was there. For a long-range reconnaissance unit in Siberia, the hum was there. It was a constant, unnerving reminder that the enemy was not coming. The enemy was already present. He was in the air, above them, circling, watching, and waiting, his presence woven into the very fabric of the electromagnetic spectrum. The impenetrable shield of the motherland had become a cage, and the hum was the sound of the bars rattling, endlessly. The scattered, anecdotal reports of phantom aircraft did not remain scattered for long. In the Soviet system, everything was reported, logged, and filed. And eventually, those files landed on desks in quiet, smoke-filled offices deep within the Ministry of Defense in Moscow. Here, away from the howling Arctic winds and the glowing cathode ray screens, the true picture began to emerge, not with a bang, but with the chilling, undeniable logic of a cartographer connecting the dots. The man tasked with making sense of this cascade of unsettling data was General Ivan Mishin, the Deputy Chief of Analysis for the Voiska PVO. Mishin was a veteran of the Great Patriotic War, a man who understood warfare in terms of tank columns, artillery barrages, and clear front lines. But the war he was now fighting was one of fleeting electronic ghosts and statistical probabilities. By early 1963, his analysts had compiled thousands of individual contact reports from every corner of the Soviet Arctic, from the Kola Peninsula to the shores of Chukotka. They pinned each report to a vast map of the Northern Hemisphere that covered an entire wall of their analysis center. At first, the pins seemed random. a chaotic sprinkling of anomalous events. But as more data flowed in from radar stations, from naval patrols, from the newly established signals intelligence posts that did nothing but listen to the electromagnetic spectrum, a terrifying pattern began to resolve itself from the noise. The pins were not random, they formed distinct, repeating arcs. Two colossal, sweeping paths that skirted the edges of their airspace. One snaked over the North Atlantic and looped toward the Mediterranean. The other, the source of most of the Arctic alerts, formed a great, sickle-shaped orbit over the polar ice cap. The final horrifying piece of the puzzle came from the GRU, the main intelligence directorate. Their agents had confirmed the existence of a new American military strategy, a permanent 24-hour airborne alert. They even had its name, Operation Chrome Dome. For General Mishin, seeing the completed map was a moment of dreadful clarity. This was not a series of reconnaissance probes. This was a siege. The Americans had constructed a fail-safe line in the sky, a celestial cage from which their nuclear-armed bombers could strike at any moment. The Soviet Union's vast, continent-spanning air defense system, their pride and joy, was designed to stop an enemy at the gate. But the enemy had never planned on storming the gate. He had simply built a permanent gallows just outside the walls and was waiting patiently, eternally, for the order to kick the stool. The realization that dawned in that Moscow office was not just one of military vulnerability, but of profound strategic impotence. They had spent a decade and incalculable billions of rubles building a shield, only to discover the enemy was wielding a sword that could strike from a direction they had never thought to defend. The first response from the Kremlin was a surge of furious, almost frantic activity. The dawning truth prompted a desperate scramble for countermeasures. The challenge was immense. The American B-52 seconds, particularly the later H models, flew at altitudes that were, for a sustained period, beyond the effective ceiling of most Soviet interceptors. Their endurance, thanks to aerial refueling, was practically limitless. Their electronic warfare suites could blind the PVO's best radars. The Soviet response had to be a technological leap of faith, a brute force attempt to close the gap. The first front in this new war was radar. Directives were issued to accelerate the development and deployment of a new generation of over-the-horizon early warning systems. This gave birth to colossal projects like the Dnestrem radar network. These were not mere airfield radars. They were architectural monstrosities, arrays of antennas hundreds of meters long, consuming enough electricity to power a small city, designed to bounce signals off the ionosphere and peer thousands of kilometers over the pole. Building these titans in the desolate, frozen taiga of Siberia was a monumental undertaking, a testament to the Soviet state's ability to mobilize resources against a perceived threat. But they were slow to build, staggeringly expensive, and ultimately they only confirmed what Mishin's analysts already knew. The bombers were there, always there. They could now see the ghosts more clearly, but they still couldn't touch them. To touch them, they needed a new kind of weapon. The MiG-21, for all its speed, was a point defense interceptor. It couldn't loiter, and it struggled at the B-52's operational ceiling. The order went out to the Mikoyan Gurevich Design Bureau, an order born of pure desperation. Build us a plane that can catch them. Build us something that can reach 60,000 feet in minutes, fly at 3 times the speed of sound, and carry missiles powerful enough to kill a bomber. The result of this edict was one of the most terrifying and legendary aircraft of the Cold War, the MiG-25 Foxbat. The MiG-25 was not an elegant fighter, it was a monster. Forged from nickel-steel alloy because aluminum would melt at its target speeds, it was powered by 2 Tumansky R-15 engines, turbines so colossal they were essentially repurposed cruise missile engines. It was a machine built for one purpose, a ballistic vertical sprint to the edge of space to kill high-altitude American intruders. Its development consumed a vast portion of the Soviet military's aviation budget throughout the 1960s. It was their silver bullet, their desperate technological answer to the problem of Chrome Dome. Yet, even as the first prototypes took to the sky, the fundamental strategic problem remained. One MiG-25 could perhaps kill one B-52, but how could they possibly counter an enemy that kept a dozen of them in the air, around the clock, forever? The psychological impact of this relentless pressure on the men of the PVO was immense. It was a slow-acting poison, eroding confidence and breeding a deep institutional frustration. For a pilot like Lieutenant Mikhail Belov, The thrill of the scramble was replaced by a sense of weary futility. He and his comrades were now routinely sent on ghost hunts, pushing their aircraft and their bodies to the absolute limit, burning precious fuel and airframe hours, chasing contrails on the horizon. They would return to base, shaking from the strain and the cold of the upper atmosphere, having achieved nothing but to confirm their own inability to reach the enemy. A quiet resentment began to build against their own equipment, against their commanders who sent them on these impossible missions, and most of all, against the unseen, untouchable American enemy, who played this cruel game with such effortless superiority. For the radar operators, the constant, faint blips on the edge of their screens became a form of psychological torture. Every shift was a state of high alert that never resolved. Was this blip the one? Was this the moment the orbiting bombers would finally turn south? The strain was immense. Paranoia became endemic. A flock of birds, a solar flare, a temperature inversion, any atmospheric anomaly could be interpreted as the beginning of the end. They were watchmen on a wall, forced to stare into a darkness from which a threat could emerge at any second, for years on end. This was not the heroic, decisive battle they had been promised in propaganda films. This was a long, grinding vigil of helplessness. The impenetrable shield had become a prison of anxiety, and the men holding it were slowly being worn down to the bone. Operation Chrome Dome was never just a military strategy. It was a declaration. It was the full, roaring expression of America's post-war industrial supremacy, a statement of power written in jet fuel across the stratosphere. The Soviet Union, for all its might, operated a command economy that could move mountains for a singular, focused goal, building a tank army, launching a satellite. But it was a system ill-suited for the kind of sustained, dynamic, and logistically nightmarish complexity that the Americans seemed to manage with routine efficiency. The numbers behind Chrome Dome tell a story that transcends military hardware. Between 1960 and 1968, the Strategic Air Command flew over 66,000 B-52 sorties as part of their airborne alert program. This equates to nearly 500,000 hours of flight time for the bombers alone, not counting the tens of thousands of tanker flights required to keep them aloft. They consumed billions of gallons of jet fuel. It was an enterprise that required the flawless integration of global command and control systems, worldwide basing, a massive maintenance apparatus, and a seemingly endless supply of highly trained crews willing to spend a third of their lives orbiting the planet with a payload capable of ending human history. This was the macro theme that slowly, painfully, dawned on the Soviet leadership. They were not just facing an enemy with better bombers or more advanced electronics. They were facing an entirely different kind of system. A system that could afford to keep a dozen doomsday machines in the air, 24 hours a day, simply as a matter of policy. General Curtis LeMay's philosophy was brutally simple. The purpose of the Strategic Air Command is to be able to deliver the entire stockpile of atomic bombs in a single massive attack during the first few hours of the war. Chrome Dome was the ultimate guarantee of that promise. It was the physical manifestation of mutually assured destruction, a concept that ensured peace not through defense, but through the credible, undeniable, and ever-present promise of total, reciprocal annihilation. The Soviets had built a system to survive the first punch. The Americans had built a system to guarantee the last one. But a machine of such complexity, running at full capacity under such immense pressure, cannot operate indefinitely without a single point of failure. The metal of the airframes grew fatigued. The human crews, pushed to the edge, made mistakes. The law of averages is as relentless as any enemy, and the world came to learn that the only thing more terrifying than the American airborne arsenal was the possibility of it failing. The climax of this silent 8-year siege was not a battle, but an accident. A broken arrow. The date was January 21st, 1968. The location was Thule Air Base in Greenland, a critical American outpost housing a powerful ballistic missile early warning system radar, one of the very eyes that watched over the pole for a Soviet missile launch. A B-52 Strato Fortress, callsign Hobo 28, was flying its designated Chrome Dome route over Baffin Bay. Inside the cockpit, a minor problem, a fault in the heating system, became a catastrophe. A fire started, filling the cabin with thick, acrid smoke. The crew had no choice. 6 of the 7 men ejected into the Arctic darkness, landing on the frozen sea ice. The now pilotless 700,000-pound bomber, its 8 engines still roaring, continued for a few moments on its own. Then, it began a slow, graceful, and utterly horrifying arc downwards. It slammed into the ice of North Star Bay, just 7 miles from the Tula base, at nearly 600 miles per hour. The impact and the subsequent explosion of over 100,000 gallons of jet fuel was immense, but that was not the true horror. The true horror lay in its cargo, 4 B-28Fi thermonuclear bombs. The conventional high explosives in the bombs detonated on impact, ripping the weapons apart and vaporizing them. In an instant, a radioactive plume of plutonium, tritium, and uranium spread across the pristine white landscape, contaminating a vast area with some of the most toxic substances known to man. From the Soviet Union, the GRU and KGB watched this event with a mixture of terror and utter astonishment. For years, their greatest fear had been the intentional use of these weapons. Now they were confronted with the terrifying reality of the Americans' unintentional incompetence. Through their signals, intelligence, and satellite observations, they monitored the frantic American cleanup effort, codenamed Project Crested Ice. They watched as the United States was forced to mount a small invasion of their own allies' territory, bringing in thousands of personnel to scoop up contaminated snow and ice into thousands of barrels for shipment back to America. This was the final, shocking revelation. The American advantage was not just in their technology or their industrial capacity, but in their colossal, almost arrogant tolerance for risk. They had been flying these missions for 8 years, pushing men and machines to the breaking point, accepting the possibility of a nuclear catastrophe like this as a simple cost of doing business. The Soviet system, for all its brutality, was fundamentally cautious, paranoid, and obsessed with control. To see their adversary operate with such terrifying high-stakes audacity, to see them literally crash a nuclear bomber near one of their most sensitive bases, and then have to publicly clean up the mess, was to finally understand the unbridgeable chasm between their two worldviews. The Tula crash, along with a similar accident over Palomares, Spain, 2 years earlier, was the end. The political and environmental fallout was too great. The world, now fully aware of the ghostly nuclear patrols, could no longer tolerate the risk. In 1968, Operation Chrome Dome was officially terminated. The B-52 seconds were pulled from their constant airborne alert and placed on ground-based quick reaction status. The unending hum in the electromagnetic spectrum over the Arctic faded. The persistent ghosts on the radar screens vanished. For the men of the Soviet PVO, it was as if a great weight had been lifted from the sky. In the end, the story of the silent, 8-year airborne siege is a story of contrasts. The Soviet Union, haunted by a history of devastating land invasions, built a fortress. They built the greatest shield on Earth, a static, bristling defense designed to protect the sacred soil of the motherland. It was a strategy born of fear and a deep-seated desire for absolute control over their own territory. The United States, an ocean away from its enemies, built a patrol. It created a dynamic, global system of power projection, a celestial sword of Damocles held forever over the head of its adversary. It was a strategy born of industrial confidence and a determination to fight any future war as far from its own shores as possible. For nearly a decade, the shield and the sword existed in a state of perfect, terrifying tension. The sword never fell. The shield was never struck. Yet, the mere presence of that sword, the silent, circling B-52 seconds, accomplished something profound. It forced the guardians of the shield to stare into the abyss, to confront the limits of their own technology, their own ideology, and their own endurance. It proved that in the nuclear age, dominance was not just about the ability to fight a war, but about the ability to endure the crushing psychological weight of a peace maintained on the knife edge of annihilation. The greatest shock for the Soviets was not the fear of an attack that came, but the realization that they were comprehensively outmatched by an enemy who was always already there.